Hi, this is Jeff Owens from the Classic Horrors Club podcast. Welcome to the video companion for episode 57, George Zucco Walks. This video contains highlights and bonus features from the full podcast, which you can find on SoundCloud at the link shown below. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
My soul, I got me a voodoo man. Oh, I believe to my soul, I got me a voodoo man. Oh, I wanna quit him. Oh, but I don't have a chance.
Richard, that was Voodoo Man by Lavelle White from the 1994 album Miss Lavelle, available on Apple Music. Interesting that I picked that song. Usually I'll say, why are we playing that song? Well, I'm just going to go ahead and say it. We're playing that song because it's not the name of a movie that we're going to talk about today, and we'll talk about that later. But why don't you tell people what we are going to talk about?
Well, a while back we did a whole show on Lionel Atwill, and we got a lot of good response from it. And we've done shows on Lon Chaney Jr., and I think we did Lugosi and Karloff. It's been a while, early on. So I kind of thought, what about George Zucco? He's the other mad scientist, kind of gets clumped in with Lionel Atwill. But there's a lot more to Zucco, the mad scientist role. So we're going to be taking a look at 3 films, and all of them are different for Zucco. He's not a mad scientist in all 3. And I think it's going to be fun. It's not going to be as salacious as Lionel Atwill. He had some torrid stuff there towards the end of his life. But I think these are going to be 3 fun movies. Hopefully everyone's been playing along at home. And, definitely one doesn't get talked to. I think 2 of the 3 are probably don't get enough love at all. And the other one, because it's public domain, kind of just gets clumped in with a bunch of other films. So I think these are 3 films I haven't heard anyone else talk about. So I think it'll be fun.
Yeah. What are they? What are the 3 movies?
We're going to take a look at Dr. Renault's Secret, which is not a Universal film. It's not a Hammer film. It's 20th Century Fox, and they were not really well known for their horror movies, but when they did, a handful of them, and this was one that really, I think, came off quite well. And it's got J. Carroll Nash, so
boy.
3rd month in a row for Mr. Nash, and playing a different role than he's played in previous months, so showing his versatility. We are going to go with the public domain flick Fog Island, and then wrap it up with a film we weren't going to do. And you said we'll talk about that shortly, but we're taking a look at Lured from 1947. Not Lurid, but Lured. A Lucille Ball movie. I think that's the only time we'll do Lucille Ball here on the show. But this movie has some legit horror cred because, of course, in addition to George Zucco, it's got Boris Karloff. So you get a bonus this month. Not only do we get George Zucco, you get Boris Karloff. So, and that movie was not a first-time viewing for me. Been a while, and I forgot how fun that movie was. And if you haven't seen it, you're going to want to see it by the time you get done hearing what we have to say about it.
Yeah, I enjoyed all 3 of these movies, so I can't wait to talk about them. So let's welcome everyone to this month's meeting of the Classic Horrors Club and the Classic Horrors Club podcast. This is episode 57. And let's welcome also our people on the YouTube channel.
Hello, YouTube channel, Jazz Hands.
Different video here behind me to try to even things or give a little something exciting. So if we veer into comic book discussion, I'll be ready to go.
I feel like Romper Room here is like, I see Superman and Wonder Woman, and
I should have brought out my magazine boxes and put like famous monsters on the front.
you should have. That's a goal for next month.
There we go.
Although, will we be in our studio next month? Maybe not.
I don't know. We'll have to wait till the end of the episode to find out. But I'm Jeff Owens from classichorrors.club, and across the internets from me is...
I thought you were going to say across the interstates. This is Richard Chamberlain from kccinephile.com and monstermoviekid.wordpress.com.
Okay, so our feedback did come through the Facebook group page, or no, it was email, I believe. Vincent Spinelli sent us an email at classichorrors.club@gmail.com. And we had announced our 3 movies. And Richard, I think we opened it up. We said, hey, if you know a better movie, let us know. We're happy to change it up. And Vincent did. So I'm just going to read here what he said in his email. I just finished the latest podcast on the Captive Wild Woman trilogy and quite enjoyed it. Thank you, Vincent. Concerning your next podcast, George Zucco is a fascinating subject. May I suggest that instead of Voodoo Man, in which George has a rather embarrassing role that wastes his talents, you take a look at Douglas Sirk's Lured from 1947. This film is somewhat overlooked by genre fans, yet it has such favorites as Zucco, George Sanders, Sir Cedric Hardwicke, and even an extended cameo by Boris Karloff. He then tells a little bit more about the plot. I don't want to give that away quite yet, but he says Zucco's performance is nothing short of a revelation for those only familiar with his genre work, and he proves himself quite adept at comedy as well.
Oh, yeah.
So we took Vincent's suggestion, and that is why we are doing Lured instead of Voodoo Man. But there is no song called Lured that I could find, so I played the Voodoo Man song. Richard, I meant to mention that I'm using as our guideline through our journey through George Zucco's life a book called Hollywood's Maddest Doctors. This is actually a biography of Lionel Atwill, Colin Clive, and George Zucco. I don't know why I did not see this when we were doing the Lionel Atwill episode. I used another different biography for that. But this is by Gregory William Menck. We've seen him at Monster Bash. Fantastic. This lot of, when he wrote, this is from 1998. And at that time, George Zucco's wife was still alive. So he's got a lot of personal anecdotes from her in here. And it was a great, quick read, very helpful. So you can see I have it earmarked at some places. I'll be reading some passages from that as we go through.
So you did research in a book, not on the internet. Kind of harkens back to our episode a while back where we talked about reference material. Sometimes it's good to dig out the book. And I did research from Poverty Row Horrors by Tom Weaver for Fog Island. You know why? Because I couldn't find anything on the internet about Fog Island, yet there's a whole section in this book that gave me more information that I could get on the internet. That's why books can be handy.
Nice.
More education. I'm starting to feel like LeVar Burton and Reading Rainbow.
All right, so back to George Zucco, born in Manchester, England. His father was a merchant of Greek descent, and he died when George was very young. His mother, speaking of Queen Victoria, was a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria. I had to look up lady in waiting, and I did that on the internet. And basically a personal assistant to the Queen, probably one of many, I imagine.
It'd be interesting if you would have gotten a book about ladies in waiting. That I don't know how entertaining that would have been, but
yeah. He was educated at Borden Grammar School, probably about 1896 when he was 10 years old. Went to London Polytechnic and Kent. He had honors in mathematics. He played soccer and cricket. As a teenager, he came to Canada. He worked on a farm and he developed a lifelong love of animals. His first documented stage experience was in a play called What Happened to Jones? And that took place while he was in Canada in Saskatchewan. In 1913, he made his way to New York City and he joined, he was in a vaudeville sketch called The Suffragette. Then World War I happened. This is World War I. He went back home to England and he joined the West Yorkshire Regiment. And he suffered some very real life horror during World War I. And I'm going to refer to the book now. This is his wife, Stella, says that George started as a private and became a lieutenant. He went to the front line in the trenches in France and was very badly wounded. He had his right arm shot away and he almost lost it. They managed to save the arm, but it was never very useful. The middle of his arm really had been shot away and they had to try to draw the tendons together. It was mostly skin and bone. 2 fingers of the right hand never came up afterwards. They were always turned down. The other 2 fingers and thumb were all right, so he could really manipulate. I think he camouflaged it remarkably well. It was amazing the way he managed the arm. I think most people never even knew about it.
I never saw anything in any of his movies that would
Never
indicate
visible at all. After the war, he returned to London, and this is when his stage career really began going, and he became a noted stage actor. Very interestingly, in 1929, he was in a production of Journey's End that had a bunch of people. James Whale directed it. R.C. Sheriff wrote it. It starred Colin Clive, Maurice Evans. Supposedly, Zucco sort of outshined them all and became the surprise hit character of that. It's interesting to me then that when this group up and moved to America and they made the film version of Journey's End, which Whale directed, R.C. Sheriff wrote, Colin Clive starred in, Zucco was not part of that. And I'm not sure why. I was kind of interested to learn, but did not learn that. Maybe his career in London was just going so well. He was known as a, quote, spellbinder for his magnificent presence, but he always was the perfect gentleman. And it was during this time that he met his wife, Stella. Meanwhile, he started acting in movies in England. In 1931, his first movie, The Dreyfus Case, and really kept company with some big names here in these early movies. In 1932, one called Midshipmaid with Nigel Bruce and Frederick Kerr. 1933, The Good Companions with Edmund Gwynne and John Gielgud. Then he came to Broadway, back to New York City. In 1935, he opened in the play Victoria Regina. Do you know who else was in that?
I don't know.
Mr. Vincent Price.
Oh,
and
wow.
this was the play that made Vincent Price such a star.
I remember the title sounded familiar, but I couldn't remember. Like, it seemed familiar, but yeah, I think I'd heard that before. Awesome.
Yes, with Miss Helen Hayes, and it was a big thing for her as well. Vincent Price did make a comment about George Zucco that's quoted in the book. And this is, I apologize, this is the producer, Louis D. Hayward, told this story about Vincent Price and George Zucco. In one of the Dr. Phibes films, there was a scene in which Vincent, as Dr. Phibes, was to take a drink through a hole in his neck. Well, Vincent did it so delicately, so beautifully. I asked him about it, and he said he'd remembered what George Zucco once told him. At one point in Victoria Regina, Vincent had badly overacted. My dear boy, George had said to him, remember that acting is a 6-letter word. A-C-T-I-N-G, asked Vincent. No, said George, S-U-B-T-L-E, subtle. Vincent Price thought George Zucco was terrific. About this time, Stella and, well, they didn't both have a... Siri was talking to me.
Okay. That's like...
Shut up, Siri.
Voices. Go ahead.
About this time, George and his wife Stella had their one and only child, Frances, and she had a very interesting fate that we'll return to a little bit later. They lived in Central Park, were living the high life in New York City. But then the summer of 1936 was very hot, and Victoria Regina, I guess they didn't have air conditioning back then. It shut down for the summer, and Hollywood was beckoning. So I guess rather than not work for 3 months, George Zucco and his wife and child headed out to Hollywood, and he became a contract player for MGM.
I was gonna say that was common for like stage plays.
Oh yeah.
That if particular venues would close because they didn't have air conditioning, it would get stifling, right? Because you didn't have windows, so there was just nowhere for ventilation. So yeah, they would often close during, and if they were located in an area that got warm, they would often close during the summer season. So.
Yeah, and he never went back. He sort of had that option. He had a good thing going with Victoria Regina, and he went to Hollywood and never came back. His first movie for MGM was in 1936, After the Thin Man. I bet you have seen that.
Love the Thin Man movies.
Do you recall him in it?
I don't actually. That's a series that those need to be on Blu-ray, and I think that one may be coming on Blu-ray, but they bit hard to find now. But yeah, excellent series.
Okay. Occasionally, MGM loaned him out to other studios. He made movies for 20th Century Fox and Paramount. 9 movies in 1938, and he realized he could make more freelancing, working for other studios as was needed, because MGM farming him out and then using him as a contract player was making more money off of him than he could make for himself. So became a freelancer, left MGM, and he was then one of Hollywood's busiest character players. In 1939, that was the year that sort of established him as a villain. I'm sure you know him from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. He played Moriarty, supposedly a very interesting portrayal of Moriarty.
Moriarty is a character that is played differently. Oftentimes, he's a character that is not in every single Sherlock Holmes story. I think in the books proper, he may only have an appearance in one, but yet is often used quite a bit in some film series. And so I recall that his portrayal of Moriarty was definitely good, but a different take on it. So than what you might normally expect.
Same year, he played in Cat and the Canary. This was the second comedic version with Bob Hope, and this was the first of 3 movies that he would make with Bob Hope. Then in 1940, he went to Universal and made The Mummy's Hand. That was a huge hit for Universal. As we know, it had several sequels. He would return in years later to play in The Mummy's Tomb and The Mummy's Ghost. I have a quote here regarding this stage in his career. And this is again Stella talking, and we'll come back to this later because she lived it, she knows, I guess, but she said, they really overdid it here. I really don't think Hollywood did the best that they might have done with George. And then they started making him do horror movies. Then I think was a big mistake. I hated those mummy movies. They weren't good enough for him. Always, no matter what role he was doing, George was a real professional. I don't think he could go on and give a bad performance. He loves what he did, which is one of the reasons why he was so very good. So, didn't love the Mummy so much, but made, or at least his wife didn't, but he made 3 of them, and they were very beneficial to his career. But the horror movies did start about this time. 1941, Monster and the Girl. 1942, I believe this was his first movie for Poverty Row, Mad Monster. Is that correct?
Yep.
And then the same year, our first movie, Dr. Renault's Secret.
You tried to kill Dr. Forbes at the inn last night. No. Don't keep lying to me. For years, I worked to change your appearance, make you talk. Get you in danger, all I've done for the sake of your stupid animal jealousy.
It was the same criminal who tried to kill you at the inn.
But why should anyone want to kill Larry?
Where's Noel? You surely don't suspect him.
I loved the way the story kind of played out, because it's a mad scientist has created a creature, but we don't deal with that right away. We get to know Noel you know, the man, and we get to know him, and then we find out that, well, we knew something was up with him, but then we find out exactly how he was created when George Zucco's Dr. Robert Renault decides to give us the backstory a little bit, right? And yeah, it's crazy. We ape with plastic surgery to look human, but you immediately then, it's a bit of a turn, right? Because George Zucco was somewhat likable up to this point, but then you see the way he acts towards Noel, and he grabs the whip and he puts him in a cage, and it's like immediately like, nope, don't like George Zucco. He's a bad guy. And the sympathy that you have for Noel is even greater. And it continues really through the rest of the film. You can't help but feel for him. And I think it's different than like what we got with the Jungle Woman trilogy, right? Because same premise, right? I mean, you have the ape turned into the human, and you have sympathy, but I think it was done so much better here in this particular movie than what we got in that whole trilogy. And I think a lot of it is simply because of J. Carrol Naish and just his sympathetic portrayal.
Zucco doesn't appear for till about 15 minutes into the movie.
He doesn't have a huge role. I mean, he's not a star, and that's, Zucco is not always the star in his films, but I think that once we get introduced to him, I mean, we see he can be charming. And then once we find out that there's the real him behind the charm, you can't go back at that point. And ends up, being convincing, I think, as the I don't want to say stereotypical, but he's a mad scientist. He definitely is. This is his mad scientist role. And of the three films, it's the only time we'll see him as a mad scientist this week. So, which I think is fun because we'll get a chance to see some different aspects of Zucco in the next two films.
So it's now World War II, and George Zucco became a U.S. citizen. And about this time, his mother and stepsister moved out to California. They literally had a bomb fall into their backyard, so thought it would be best for them to go somewhere safer. So they moved there. 1942, The Mummy's Tomb came out. 1943, Dead Men Walk for PRC, which is Producers Releasing Corporation of Poverty Row Company. And here's what I kind of mentioned earlier. So this is a period where George Zucco was in a lot of horror movies, but he never really got typecast like some of these other actors. Horror was his specialty, you could say, during this time, but it never restricted him from doing other things. In fact, later in his career, he did several movies that weren't in the least bit horror. So that's a little unique for, someone, Lugosi, Karloff, Chaney, didn't happen to George Zucco. He, as you may know, did a lot of radio shows. He appeared several times on Suspense. And he, at this time, was known for his professionalism on the set. They called him One Take Zucco. 1944, Return of the Ape Man. And this has a very interesting story. He is credited for being in this movie, but let me read you out of the book what they say about this. The Ape Man wasn't a role that required a horror star, just a burly type or a stuntman. It would have been completely beneath Zucco to subject himself to the makeup sessions, run around half naked, and give audiences a glimpse of his underpants. On October 6, 1943, the fifth day of production, it was announced in the Hollywood Reporter that illness had caused Zucco to withdraw from the cast of Return of the Ape Man. Horror fans have always enjoyed telling themselves that Zucco stalked off the picture when he found out what the role entailed, which very well might have been what happened. I believe, I did not find it in researching, but I think I've read before that he does appear in a long shot or something.
Yeah, I think he's on a table and you see him for a few seconds. He's also in some of the publicity stills. And I think the lobby cards, actually, I think in one of the lobby cards may have him, but I know he's in some publicity stills. And his contract stated that he still had to be credited, whether he was in the film or not, because he had, him walking off, they still had to credit him. And so he is technically in it, but it is weird because he gets kind of high billing, and you wonder, like, when you're watching it, like, where's George Zucco at? You really have to have a sharp eye to check him. It's been a long time since I've seen Return of the Ape Man.
I don't know if he was ever in a movie where he had a lot of makeup or anything. He usually just looked like himself, right?
Yeah, that probably is why he walked off once he realized, because that doesn't seem like that was his shtick, so to speak. It was not something he really wanted to do. So
1944 came Voodoo Man that we mentioned earlier. House of Frankenstein also, he had a small part, Dr. Bruno Lampini, at the beginning of that movie. And then in 1945, he teamed up with his neighbor. Did you know that Lionel Atwill was actually lived in his neighborhood?
I did not know. I wonder if George Zucco attended any of those parties.
I don't know. But they got together and made Fog Island in 1945.
Hello! The weather today on Fog Island will be foggy, with a continuous cloud of murder working its way up from the south, while this lady will have a warm front pushing out towards the west. A confluence of deception dissipating throughout the day should cause a few problems. So in summary, there'll be murder, deception, a warm front, and lots of fog.
I couldn't remember anything about the first time I watched it, and that says something. It's my least favorite of the three movies. There was potential for this movie to be more than what it ultimately was. And I think because it was a Poverty Row film dealing with a micro budget, essentially, it ultimately couldn't cross to that next level because it didn't have the financial resources to be better than what it was. And so the budget becomes a hindrance. And because you've got George Zucco and Lionel Atwill together doing a really good job in their respective roles. You had some interesting supporting cast, some stronger than others. You had a good premise, I think, kind of the old dark house kind of setup. You had the fact that there was the Fog Island, and if we would have had just a little bit more, maybe we could have seen some scenes might have really enhanced it, like actually seeing the guests coming to the island on a boat rather than just hearing about it, and basically see them walking in through the fog as we're looking out the front door through what is a very stagey set. Certain things like that, I think, would have enhanced the movie, and unfortunately makes the movie feel kind of cheap, which is what you get sometimes with public domain films. Doesn't mean it's a bad movie. I just kept seeing potential that wasn't actually
Realized.
Yeah, it wasn't realized. So,
well, I have to tell you, inexplicably, I loved this movie, and I liked it better than Dr. Renault's Secret.
Wow. Okay.
It definitely, you can see that it was a play, and I want to see that play though. I thought it was very funny, very clever. I loved some of the lines. For some reason, and this is very odd. More so in Lured than Dr. Renault's Secret, but this is the first time I saw George Zucco, and like he had a sparkle in his eye and he had his voice, and I was like, oh, I see why you were such a popular character actor.
And see, I want to say that's very evident in another movie he did called The Black Raven, which is similar to this. I had seen The Black Raven prior to this, because I'm going to be covering that on the blog. And in The Black Raven, he's playing someone who was wronged and kind of out to get revenge a little bit. The subplots are very different, but he's playing kind of a similar character. And he's doing it better in The Black Raven. And so that's where I immediately was comparing. I was like, this is kind of like that, but it was better in The Black Raven with just as much of a limited budget, yet that print's also a little clearer than what I was watching. And there's certain things that were playing out a little bit better in that movie. So that's something that I think, had I not seen The Black Raven, I might be more on your page. I think the movie would have been interesting to see them swap the roles, because I think Atwill would have been a better Leo Granger, because he would have been the over the top, you know, he would have been doing things with his eyes, as Atwill always did. Last night, late night, after watching Joe Bob, the film detective had the vampire bat, and I watched the last half hour of that, and it's just, his eyes are just everywhere in that movie. I think he would have been interesting to see him as the character of Leo seeking revenge, and George Zucco playing that more subdued role of Alec Richfield. That would have been very interesting for me to see.
A year later, George Zucco made The Flying Serpent. This was his farewell to PRC and Poverty Row. In 1947, he was still prolific, still being in a lot of movies, and not just horror movies, as I mentioned earlier. And he made movies for several studios, including United Artists, where he made, in 1947, our next movie, Lured.
I'm going away with him. Me and my big blue eyes are going bye-bye for good.
And that was the last you saw of Lucy Bunn?
All I know is she met him through the personal column.
But the unknown person we seek only goes after young, beautiful girls.
Then I'm to be the bait.
You're alone, aren't you? It occurred to you that I might be the one you were waiting for.
As a matter of fact, it has.
3 girls were here before me who left for parts unknown.
Lucy. Looks like I'm next, doesn't it?
Are you afraid?
You'll never leave this room alive.
Yeah, everything about this is just compared to the other two, is just a lush production. I love the opening credits, you know, a spotlight shining down the street, and as it pivots to a stone brick wall or something, you see one of the credits. It's just, it's a little longer than the others, not much. It's not over 2 hours, but it just zips by. I don't want to say I was reluctant to watch it again. Sometimes I don't watch movies over and over a lot because there's just so many new things I want to watch. And I was like, I was a little disappointed that, like you, I forgot how wonderful it is. And I am so glad that I watched it, because it just flew by and I loved every minute of it.
Well, I got it originally because it's Boris Karloff. So when I was going through and trying to get all the Boris Karloff films, it was readily available at the time from Kino Video, and I snatched it up. And then I remember at the time being a little disappointed because Boris Karloff only has really one section of the film. But I remember really enjoying all the rest of it. And then I kind of forgot about it. Maybe I saw this twice because I remember covering Boris Karloff films over at Monster Movie Kid. But then that's been quite a few years ago now. And so I didn't really remember anything about this movie other than, I remember being really pleasantly surprised by Lucille Ball's performance.
And so George Zucco, his role in this is just amazing. It's different than anything we've seen or talked about today.
Yes.
And he is so funny, and the little bit with the crossword puzzles. And yet he's like just a fully fleshed character, because he gets this sort of rapport relationship with Lucy, and Yeah, man, I want to see more of him also in the sequel.
Well,
you know?
yeah. So his role of Officer Barrett, I mean, he's kind of a hero of the piece in a way, really. I mean, he plays a big part in getting her away from Boris Karloff's character of Charles Van Druten, which we'll talk about his performance in a second because it was just classic Karloff. But and then, of course, in the big climax of the film, he comes crashing through a window. He's got blood on his face from crashing through the window, coming to Sandra's aid. He clearly had not a love affection, but he like almost like a brotherly affection for her, and wanted to protect her and wanted to make sure she was safe. And that was fun. That was fun to see him in this role. Again, as we said, very different than what we'd seen him in the other two films, and comedic, as you said. Yeah, there's little crossword puzzles, when they go to the musical performance, not his thing at all. And, and he's just not engaged, and he'd rather play his crossword puzzle. But when you first see him, you don't like, because it's George Zucco and he's like lurking in windows and stuff. Is he the bad guy? Who is he? No, he's actually a good guy. So
two things. So first of all, those crossword scenes are great for him, but it's also great for Lucy's character, because that shows how smart she is. She's feeding him the answer in a reply that is just so matter of fact, and she knows, and you had to think ahead to be able to say that. And yes. I just think that's terrific.
Amen. Of the three, I would say this is my favorite of the three, with Dr. Renault's Secret being second, and then Fog Island being third for me.
And I'm flipped. I like this best, Fog Island, and then Dr. Renault's Secret. Well, let's go into the last few years of his life. This is where it gets a little tragic for poor George Zucco, who just seems like such a nice man, doesn't he?
Yeah.
1951, he was 65 years old, still making movies, and was working on a movie, The Desert Fox, and this is what Stella Zucco remembers happening. They were about halfway through the making of The Desert Fox. George left one morning as usual, and later that morning, 20th Century Fox called me and said George had been taken ill. Would I come down? He got on the stage, couldn't remember his lines, and didn't know where he was. They thought it was just temporary. The director, Henry Hathaway, said, we'll shoot around him until he feels better. Well, he didn't feel any better, and we learned later that he suffered a stroke. I took him home. He never made another picture. So very sad. And you mentioned earlier that his life was not as crazy, or I don't remember the word you used, as Lionel Atwill's, and we certainly learned about that in our episode. But there was a horrible rumor that it almost was. A book called Hollywood Babylon 2. It detailed outlandish legends that George Zucco was a raving madman, believed he was one of the mad scientists he had played, and went out onto the streets in his voodoo man costume. This also claimed that he died in an insane asylum. Well, none of this appears to have any basis in reality. In fact, Stella, his wife, as I told you, lived till 1998. One of the rumors was that his wife and daughter were so distraught that he died that they both committed suicide. Well, not true. Stella, as we know, was alive till 98, lived to be 98 years old. And his daughter, poor thing, died exactly 20 months after her father from throat cancer.
I did read, and again, you wonder about whether or not there's any truth to this, that supposedly he was offered the mad scientist role in Voodoo Woman in 57, but couldn't because of his health. I don't know if there's any truth to that. He had been out of acting.
The story in this book is a variation of that. And this, I think, is so sweet. His agent, his former agent and producer, Alex Gordon, that was all a setup for him to make him feel better. So they went through the motions of offering him this part. And he went down to do an audition. They took him, actually, and bless his heart, he found out what the role was going to be. And he said, well, I really have in mind something a little more sophisticated than that. And he turned the part down. So, you know, again, I don't know if that's true or not, but I mean, always a gentleman to the end. And that movie was made, and Tom Conway played that part. Yeah, and of course, this is his wife talking, but she tells her side of the story. That book implied that George was violent. He was never violent. The doctor had warned me that he might become violent, but in fact, it was the other way. He became very docile. Once it was rather really funny. I was visiting George at the sanitarium, and he said to me, I think you did a very good job when you bought this place. So he was comfortable and content, and he thought of the sanitarium as our home. So his illness lasted 9 years before he died on May 27th, 1960, of pneumonia. Like you said, he was 74 years old. Richard, our last song, I needed this. We're not done yet. I have to talk to you about this. It's called The Mummy's Hand. It's from a K-Tel record by Zip Kaplan and Cast of Thousands. It's from the 2008 album Monsters and Heroes. It's available on Apple Music, but have you ever heard of such a thing? Because this is fascinating. They're instrumentals, but they have the Universal March. But this is like the Miko of Universal movies, because it's a
the Miko. Oh my god,
like synthesized type version. I might play that as well, but all of the tracks are named Universal after Universal movies. There's Bride of Frankenstein. I can't tell if it's the actual like theme music. There's one for Godzilla. I clicked on it and it's not the Godzilla march that we're familiar with. So, you know, I don't know if these are just inspired by the movies or if they're actually using music, but this one's The Mummy's Hand. George Zucco was in The Mummy's Hand. I thought that would be an interesting way to go out.